In this video, part 3 of this series, I'll continue discussing my favorite orchestral moments for timpani and bass drum. I ended the second video with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, so now let's jump forward a few decades to Wagner's legendary Ring Cycle, consisting of 4 operas that took him 26 years to complete, beginning in 1848. My first example from the first of these operas, Das Rheingold, is the intimidating entrance of the two giants, Fasolt and Fafner, represented by a terrifying fortissimo leitmotif played by the low brass, strings, and of course, timpani. Remember that a leitmotif is just a musical representation of a person, place, or thing in the storyline. This timpani leitmotif eventually returns as a brilliant transformation in the second act of the third opera, Siegfried. In the intervening many hours of music and drama, Fafner has murdered his brother Fasolt and has transformed himself into a fearsome dragon that the young hero Siegfried now encounters in the forest. Siegfried's long unaccompanied horn call that includes his famous leitmotif awakens Fafner, and we hear the tubas play the dragon leitmotif that had also first appeared many hours ago in Das Rheingold, when a different character, the dwarf Albrecht, transformed himself into a dragon. Notice also this third leitmotif representing Siegfried's sword, Notung. But more importantly for this video, when Fafner finally speaks, notice the return of his timpani leitmotif, but now playing the interval of a tritone instead of the original perfect fourth, to symbolize Fafner's own sinister transformation. By the 1870s, when Wagner had completed his Ring Cycle, composers were regularly calling for timpani intervals other than the traditional perfect fourth or perfect fifth, something we already saw from Beethoven in the last video. We're also regularly calling for more than the traditional 2 drums, something we already saw from Mozart in the last video. And we're also often calling for more than one timpanist, something Berlioz had famously done in his 1830 Symphonie Fantastique, and less famously but more exorbitantly in his Requiem. The 1870s also saw the invention of the foot pedal, allowing timpanists to rapidly tune the drum with their feet while simultaneously playing with their hands. Watch for these developments in the remaining passages I discuss in this series, starting with the one we just heard that you'll notice was scored for the second pair of timpani. During the ensuing pre-fight trash talk between Siegfried and Fafner, tension builds as the transformed tritone timpani motif alternates between second and first timpani in a rising chromatic scale, so B natural, C sharp, and D natural. Amazingly, these entries are actually outlining the original green dragon leitmotif, that itself is essentially an upward chromatic scale. All this trash talk eventually leads to the fight, during which we again hear the sword leitmotif, the dragon leitmotif, and Siegfried's horn leitmotif. The intensity builds to a climax when the tritone timpani motif suddenly returns, now fortissimo, and Siegfried stabs the dragon in the heart, represented musically by one final entrance of the sword leitmotif, and by this fortissimo crash of the cymbals at the exact moment it occurs. Fafner now has a mortal stab wound of the heart, yet somehow still has time for a lengthy death speech, during which we continue hearing this timpani motif. But notice that when he sings that the giants Fasolt and Fafner, the brothers, both are now fallen, the motif briefly reverts to the original perfect fourth giant version, though this time not played by the timpani that instead play these figures. But at the end of this sentence, the motif immediately returns to the tritone dragon version. This brilliant attention to detail in nearly every page of the score, in the more than 14 hours of music that make up Wagner's Ring Cycle, is just astonishing.
Fasolt und Fafner, die Brüder, fielen nun beide.
Eventually, Fafner makes his final utterance, the name Siegfried, after which fragments of both the green dragon motif and the timpani motif die down to one final pianissimo timpani note as he finally expires. Moving on, I'm skipping over Brahms in this video, since I've already discussed most of my favorite timpani passages from his music in prior videos, from the relentless hammering that opens his first symphony, to the apocalyptic plagal cadence that ends the first movement of his fourth symphony. And speaking of apocalyptic, my next example is from Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, sometimes nicknamed the Apocalyptic. I personally think this nickname might be more appropriate for his Ninth Symphony, though I will admit that this iconic opening of the Eighth Symphony's finale, with a 2-bar crescendo of this galloping grace note string accompaniment, introducing the menacing theme played by the brass, does sometimes make me imagine the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse charging towards me. Notice that the big D-flat timpani entrance we just heard is just the first of many timpani tunings required for this movement. D-flat, E-flat, A-flat, C, F, and B-flat, and that the movement itself is in C minor, yet implies F-sharp as the tonic in this opening. Like most Bruckner themes, this one wanders tonally, eventually cadencing on the D-flat major chord we just heard. I stopped the music right before my favorite timpani passage, when this roll dies away for 1 bar, but then explodes with this fortissimo solo consisting of the same galloping grace note rhythmic motif, something percussionists call a flam, to introduce the repeat of the phrase now in A-flat, accompanied by the second of the timpani tunings. Since this phrase begins a whole step above the first one, it also cadences a whole step above on an E-flat major chord, accompanied by the third timpani tuning. We then finally hear the key of the movement, C minor, accompanied by the fourth timpani tuning, and this jump sounds natural because E-flat is just the relative major of C minor. Ever since first hearing this symphony, I've wondered why Bruckner didn't repeat the exciting timpani solo at the end of this second phrase, and I used to imagine what it would have sounded like, since I never had a Brucknerian orchestra at my disposal to do the experiment. Luckily, now with audio editing software, we can all hear what my blasphemous edit would have sounded like. As we just heard twice, this opening uses the first 4 timpani tunings, but now let's jump to another incredibly powerful timpani moment later in the exposition section that uses the final 2 tunings, though I should say final 3, since this forceful section actually requires 2 F timpani an octave apart, in addition to the third B-flat drum. Please also check out my prior Bruckner videos for more amazing timpani moments, like this incredibly intense moment that begins the recapitulation section in the opening movement of his 6th symphony, or this breathtakingly gorgeous timpani pedal point from the opening movement of his 7th. Moving on to one of my favorite orchestrators, Richard Strauss, before I reveal my favorite of his timpani and bass drum passages, I guess I should also mention his most famous, the opening of Also sprach Zarathustra, that begins with a literal pedal point played on the pedal of the organ, doubled by the contrabassoon, contrabasses, and bass drum, that introduces one of the most well-known timpani solos in orchestral music. But my favorite bass drum and timpani passage by Strauss is from my favorite of his many masterful symphonic poems, Don Quixote, an absolute tour de force of orchestration, thematic transformation, counterpoint, and musical storytelling that I regard so highly that I spent the first 3 minutes of my Death and Transfiguration deep dive video talking instead about Don Quixote. Specifically, the brilliant second variation that uses flutter-tonguing to simulate the flock of sheep he imagines as an army and defeats in one of his rare victories. Someday, when I have more energy, or more Patreon supporters, I'll do an extremely long and complicated Don Quixote deep dive. But for this video, adequately explaining my favorite timpani and bass drum moment requires at least a shallow dive to understand which themes represent which characters. The composition begins with the flutes and oboes playing this short D major motif, representing Don Quixote, who, remember, is a gentleman who loses his mind, imagines himself to be a knight, and embarks on numerous amusing and mostly ill-fated adventures. Later in this long introduction, the solo cello that represents his character for the remainder of the piece finally enters with the entire theme, beginning with that same small motif, though now in minor, and then consisting of multiple additional small motifs. The passage I chose for this video is the final 10th variation, in which Don Quixote is defeated in battle by the Knight of the White Moon, in reality just a concerned neighbor trying to convince him to come home and avoid further injuries. The variation begins with a timpani roll, and that first Don Quixote motif, but slower and dispersed among many instruments, making it hard to visualize but still easy to hear, answered by its original version, and then by the second motif, third motif, and actually a fifth motif from much later in the theme that I didn't play for you before, all occurring at once. The first Don Quixote motif now repeats, but this time we suddenly hear this fanfare representing the Knight of the White Moon. This combination continues, but now accompanied by a roll of the bass drum to increase the suspense as their horses run towards each other. One more incomplete entry of Don Quixote's motif brings us to the most climactic moment, when unexpectedly the whole orchestra drops out for half a bar, except for the continuing suspenseful bass drum roll and the sudden triple forte entrance of the lone solo cello, completing the motif from the prior page. Even at triple forte, this single note seems comically pathetic when immediately completely drowned out by the ensuing, also triple forte entrance of most of the wind instruments playing the Night of the White Moon's fanfare. A perfect representation of Don Quixote's delusional confidence just before being knocked to the ground by his opponent. This moment of battering also includes my all-time favorite Strauss timpani passage, when they suddenly reappear to reinforce the hammering rhythm of the fanfare. After this embarrassing defeat, we continue hearing incomplete entries of the orange motif, likely meant to depict the stunned Don Quixote floundering on the ground, before this whole episode ends with an abrupt rest. The Night of the White Moon now holds Don Quixote to his promise that if defeated, he would return home and stop trying to be a knight, and Don Quixote's tragic homeward march of shame is now depicted musically by this constant drumbeat from the timpani, over which the orchestra plays numerous themes from prior episodes to represent his entire delusional career as a knight, flashing before his eyes all at once as his mind gradually clears and he comes back to his senses. Before I play for you this spectacular passage, I briefly have to acquaint you with each of these themes so you know what to listen for. I'll start with this purple theme that represents Sancho Panza, Don Quixote's illiterate but extremely loyal squire who rides a donkey. When it first appears, this theme is played by the bass clarinet and tenor tuba, two of the most humorous sounding instruments in the orchestra, followed by this second motif played by the solo viola. Next, this green theme represents Dulcinea, the imaginary object of Don Quixote's courtly love, though based on an actual peasant woman from a neighboring town. Her theme first appears as this wistful oboe solo, accompanied by strums from the harp. But the version of this theme that appears in the final 10th variation includes this distinctive turn, so let's first hear how that version sounds in a different context. In the glorious 3rd variation, during which Don Quixote is fantasizing about her, and we hear her theme with the turn portion entering in very close imitative counterpoint. Try to ignore in this recording the unintentional, even closer imitative counterpoint played by the glockenspiel. Also, since this is a video about timpani, notice how you can almost hear Don Quixote's heart swelling when this timpani roll crescendos. Next, we have these dark blue downward glissandos, more of a sound effect than a theme, that often appear during moments of humiliation, like at the end of the fourth variation, when a procession of pilgrims knocks Don Quixote off his horse. Notice the Sancho Panza theme, played by the same three instruments, as he helps his master, who is lying on the ground in a daze, after which we hear two humiliation glissandos played by the bass tuba and contrabassoon to end the variation. By the way, when it makes sense in conversations with friends, I've been known to make the so-called sad trombone sound effect, either the tritone, wah, wah, or the descending chromatic scale, wah, 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 wah. But I think from now on, I might just use the humiliation glissando instead. Whoa. Now returning to the passage of interest, the relentless timpani drum beat accompanies staggered imitative entries at different speeds of that fourth Don Quixote motif that we haven't yet heard in this variation, combined first with both the humiliation glissandos and this single intense shrieking entry of the Dulcinea theme, completely transformed from its usual character. Then we hear the original first Don Quixote motif, combined with both the viola Sancho Panza motif and the bass clarinet and tenor tuba Sancho Panza motif. As I mentioned before, this cacophonous mess eventually resolves as Don Quixote's mind clears, and at this point in the story, he briefly contemplates becoming a simple shepherd instead of a knight. So of course we now hear the sheep theme from the second variation, combined with the Sancho Panza motifs. Here's what that theme originally sounded like for those of you who didn't watch that prior video, accompanied by the hilarious flutter-tonguing sheep noises. Now, as you finally listen to this incredible passage from the final variation, try to remember all of these themes at once, united only by the constant drumbeat of the timpani. Moving on, the Mahler symphonies contain so many of my favorite timpani and bass drum passages that I could easily dedicate an entire video in this series just to him, but I'll conclude this video by doing the impossible and choosing only one example from the otherworldly third movement of his Fourth Symphony. Loyal followers of this channel know from prior videos that I consider the final bars of this movement to be some of the most sublimely ethereal music ever composed. But this ending is preceded by a powerful triumphant outburst that includes incredible moments for both bass drum and timpani. This sudden explosion is even more surprising because of the preceding bars that die down to triple piano, playing two of the main motifs of the movement. These downward sighing motifs and these pizzicato figures in the bass. Remember especially this portion for later. The outburst from the whole orchestra includes an immediate timpani roll, quickly joined by the triangle, and these invigorating string and harp arpeggios. When the trumpets enter, listen for this cymbal crash on the downbeat, followed by this astonishing entrance of the bass drum. For me, the most glorious bass drum moment I can think of from any orchestral music, that I can only describe as the shattering of boundaries between two dimensions. This quickly fades away to prepare for the fortissimo entrance of the timpani in the next bar, playing that pizzicato bass motif from just before the outburst, that is now also still being played by the pizzicato contrabasses. Of course, even the giant contingent of contrabasses Mahler preferred for his symphonies, playing triple forte pizzicato notes, isn't much of a match for a single timpanist playing the same motif with both mallets for extra emphasis. This accompanies the trumpets playing the pink sighing motif, with the horns playing these triumphant dotted figures, before both horns and trumpets suddenly play for the only time in this movement these themes returning from the first movement, and that also reappear shortly after this in the finale. Mahler now returns to the motifs from this movement to end this outburst and set the stage for the most breathtaking ending of almost any music I've ever heard. My discussion of which you can hear in that video from 7 years ago. But to end this video, just listen to this glorious percussive outburst.